Hello. Our story begins on the Sith home world. Grandmaster Yoda entered the Grand Sith Temple. Thoughts ran through his mind as he waddled closer to the entrance. He wondered if it would have made any difference investigating the Sith Temple prior to the beginning of the war. Maybe some good could have been done to stop the Sith by coming here sooner. His cane kept him upright as he entered the massive structure. Even though Yoda pondered if it would be worth his time to be here, or if the Sith could have been stopped by destroying this temple, he was surrounded by darkness. He didn't know it, but back in the core, the Sith were plotting Yoda's downfall. Tyrannus was visiting Sidious to try and corrupt Yoda, and if not corrupt him, then kill him, using ancient Sith spells and alchemy. The Grand Master wasn't very concerned with that, because his first challenge presented itself. As he walked through the temple, he found an old Jedi Master, Sidious, whose crashed ship had been found in the weeks before. He saw a man chained up by force restraints, crying out for help, telling Yoda that he had discovered great secrets and he needed the Grand Master to surrender himself so that he could also gain the knowledge. Yoda, even though he wanted to so badly, with every fiber of his being, to stop the Sith, denied this request. He knew that Sidious had died 13 years before, a shameful loss, but one that had happened nonetheless. Yoda, by rejecting this, was able to enter further into the temple, where the Sith spirit of Darth Bane would present itself for the first time. Instead of using ancient Sith to corrupt Yoda, they started with Sidious. Palpatine didn't believe the age-old Grand Master would know about Bane, but he did, referring to the Sith Lord by name when he appeared. The long-lost Sith spoke with Sidious's voice, an entity that truly didn't exist or even live. His soul was trapped on Korriban long ago, and now Yoda walked across the graves of thousands of Sith. Their fight with the light had long since ended, but their anger, rage, and fury was housed inside this temple. The Baneite lineage had continued, and old fools like Yoda assumed their ancient rival had died out. Darth Bane, while simply being a creation of the current Sith, was not gone forever. His body may have been buried in the Valley of Dark Lords, on what the modern Sith called Moraband, but his body was moved. One of his descendants returned and placed him inside the temple. This individual believed Bane to be the greatest Sith to ever exist, and gave him a mausoleum to commemorate his sacrifices for the betterment of the Sith and the galaxy. This individual, who moved the resting space of the Sith Lord, also attempted to resurrect him, and failed multiple times. The soul imbued in the dead body was trapped like a curse, attached to Bane's legendary Orbalisk armor. Sidious did not know of this failed resurrection, but he knew of the resting place and led Yoda to it. The entire thing was a diversion, something to push him further in the darkness. During this, the Grand Master would fight a darker version of himself, but it wouldn't yield any results, and after coming to the conclusion that Master Yoda was unbreakable, Tyrannus and Sidious left him alone. Yoda, though, didn't know that. He was pushing Sith spirits away from him and connecting harmoniously to the Force. These were lessons learned on Dagobah. Despite the planet being surrounded in the dark side of the Force, Yoda was a beaming glimmer of light. His presence was a warm glow in the cold. That, though, was the last piece to the puzzle. The old Sith who tried to resurrect Darth Bane needed one key ingredient to bring him back: the light side of the Force. It was impossible for a Sith to find that, let alone bring that to Moraband willingly. Sidious, the old Sith, and Yoda created the perfect mixture of swelling in the Force. Yoda's deep meditation and reliance on the light to protect himself from Palpatine's attempts to sway his heart and mind had given the temple a resurgence of light, unseen in its entire history. This bursted the Sith altar open and sent a beam of life into the mausoleum that housed Darth Bane. The ritual was mostly alchemic. Other Sith along the way tried it, but never got anywhere. The work done by this nameless individual inspired much of Plagueis the Wise's greatest practices of the Force. They were the blueprint. Plagueis took everything to a much higher level, and he also never intended to bring back a dead Sith Lord, which is why he never attempted to resurrect Bane. Yoda, however, did not know he was the needed antidote to this failed experiment. The Sith Lord came to life, releasing a heavy breath as his bones, sitting under a set of armor, slowly poured into existence. Darth Bane's resurrection was not an enjoyable process. It was very painful, and it consisted of the binding of skin cells that were left behind. This was the way of the Sith, though. To exist was to feel suffering, but that suffering only made one stronger. Bane's eyes shot open and he seethed. Why had he returned? Yoda, still inside the temple, hadn't felt this rise. He didn't even know he was the reason of it happening. He hoped to find answers that wouldn't ever present themselves. He was preparing to join up with R2-D2 inside the starfighter and return to Coruscant having failed. The war was coming to an end. Yoda just needed to hope that his former student had designed the tool to destroy the Jedi. Tyrannus' position on Kamino was more concerning than anything else, and it was time for Yoda to leave Moraband. Just behind him, the old Sith Lord stretched out his hands and yelled without vocal cords, a silent scream, filled with more pain than he had ever experienced in his past life. In some ways, he wanted to see what his apprentice would do with the galaxy. Zana was a Sith he knew would thrive, but he didn't necessarily want to return either. That was the irony in the individual who started this resurrection process, and the irony he never realized. His idol would never want to come back from the dead. The rule of two was meant to be passed on, to utilize the gifts of each newer generation to ensure the survival of the Sith themselves. Bane, though, finally with all the alchemy reconstructing his blood and veins, his skin and organs, rose. He stumbled forward first. His lightsaber was still in his hand, and his armor was quite dusty. He fell out of his mausoleum and looked around. Before he could wonder about the Sith of the modern era, or determine why he was back, he sensed something that brought him rage. A Jedi. He shook the rust from his shoulders and stormed forward, twisting his saber in his hands. All of his skills, memories, talents, and lessons in the Force and combat still existed within him. He was wholly himself the day he died. Nothing had changed, and he was ready to make sure the individual who broke their sanctuary of darkness paid the price for their lack of vision. He may have been storming towards the Jedi, but his footsteps were silent. Not only was Bane alive, but the temple, finally with a Sith walking its hallowed halls, mimicked his resurrection. The ancient layer of the Sith was finally alive, and it breathed with fury. Bane ripped his hand forward when he saw the little green Jedi Master and fired a burst of electricity that covered Yoda's body. He didn't even have time to react, aside from turning back towards the sound. Yoda was flung from his feet and into a pillar nearby. On impact, he was completely knocked out. As Bane prepared to shove his saber into Yoda's body, he noticed some different technology. Time had passed by, but how much time he needed to learn. Using some alchemic powers, he created a blue binding restraint to keep Yoda imprisoned inside the temple, similar to what Yoda saw Sidious in. While he waited for the Jedi Master to return to consciousness, Bane looked for a transport. Surely this Jedi came here with something he could use. When Bane found R2 in the starfighter, the astromech pulled away. There were some shots fired, but they were all deflected, and the astromech just piloted away so that he could keep the ship's energy high and maintain his own power cells. If Yoda was dead, then he needed to be ready to leave. Without the Grand Master, though, R2 was unsure of what to do. He didn't want to abandon Yoda yet. Inside the temple, when Yoda woke up, he saw the Sith figure towering over him, and became immediately confused. There were few records on Darth Bane inside the temple, but like the apparition before him, it matched his description. Yoda addressed Bane as he had the apparition, believing to be yet another test, and truthfully, the Sith Lord was bewildered. The Jedi didn't fear him in the slightest. Bane demanded to know answers, but Yoda wasn't really here to be interrogated. He would play this as it fit his own needs, though he would answer one question off the bat, that being that it had been just under 1,000 years since Bane's death. This information crushed the Sith Lord. He didn't realize that Yoda was a multi-century old Grand Master. He thought that Yoda was an elder, but not a member of the Council, so, from his perspective, a lower-level Jedi investigator that didn't fear the Sith in the slightest. Not knowing Yoda's species or knowing what Yoda was in the Order completely demoralized Bane. The Sith had existed for thousands of years, and it was his rule of two that had destroyed their cause. But that wasn't totally right, and for some reason he knew that without knowing it. Yoda told Bane the truth, but he didn't tell him everything. The one problem with being resurrected after 900 years was the shock of every emotion, sensation, and feeling coming back at you, after not having had them since being embraced by death. Bane, after having time by himself and getting into his interrogation with Yoda, finally felt the shift in the galaxy, which was a shift from the old he knew to the new that was now. When Bane died, there was peace. There were some troubles, but it was mostly peaceful. He eyed Yoda and asked why it felt like a war was taking place. It felt like the galaxy was divided, and thousands of souls perished every hour from unnatural causes. And the defeated elder nodded the word war. He didn't speak much and had no intention to negotiate information with Bane. Yoda was busy trying to understand how this individual had returned, so he was doing everything in his power to keep himself and Bane on a level playing field. The Grand Master could accept dying here and allowing his order to persist without him. He just hoped that R2 would take the starfighter back to the temple and inform someone, so at least they knew. Yoda didn't require or really want a rescue operation. He'd be happy dying here, just knowing that Bane couldn't do anything and wouldn't ever be able to escape. Well, R2 had other ideas, and he'd wheel himself into the temple to search for Yoda. He took out the engine igniters and hid them in his body, so Bane couldn't try and squeeze into the smaller fighter if he wanted to escape. It didn't really matter anyways because Bane was actually too tall to get into it. R2 stayed out of sight and listened as Bane and Yoda spoke back and forth. They weren't exactly friendly with each other, but the old Sith Lord tried to be as kind as possible to his captor because Yoda held all the information he desired. If the Sith still existed, he didn't know. War could be started by anyone, not just a Sith, and Bane knew that, though the scale of the conflict he felt through the Force was much larger than any faction turning on another, at least he thought, but a lot could happen in about 1,000 years. After hours of pissing each other off, R2 would attempt to break Yoda off of his restraints, but when the astromech zapped the blue Force wires, they fired a burst back into him and shut R2 down completely. The astromech was completely offline, and Yoda didn't get a chance to stop R2 because the droid snuck up behind him to try and break him free. Bane would be surprised by the clanging of R2 falling over, but he didn't really care about the astromech. He would try and get into the ship, but firstly, he didn't fit, and secondly, it wouldn't turn on. Maybe the tech was too different, but he literally could not get the ship to turn on. So Bane got frustrated and returned to the temple to try and gather more information from Yoda. After about the first 24 hours, and Bane being kind enough to give some killed animals for food and water to Yoda, they spoke about the darkness in the galaxy. While Moraband wasn't the hive of good eats or lush forests, there was enough natural resources around the abandoned temple that they took advantage of to maintain their energy. Yoda and Bane didn't discuss a ton of the current galaxy, but without alluding to the survival of the Sith, the Grand Master informed his opponent that there was a grand war, one with clones and battle droids. It was larger than anything Bane saw in his lifetime, and it eclipsed some of the battles of the times before and after his life. Bane was very fascinated in this, but instead of focusing on breaking Yoda, he decided that they'd best be acquaintances, to a degree. This isn't to say Bane had grown a soft spot since his death, or had any intention to turn to the light. This was him recognizing that the cards were not in his favor. He needed to sway Yoda to learn more about the Sith and their fate, or about the war itself, but the concern of the Sith is mostly what pushed him. He could kill this individual no problem, but that didn't yield any answers, which Bane needed more than anything. So they ate and spoke. Some of their speaking was philosophical, like the differences between the Jedi and the Sith. Other topics were less deep and more dense. Bane wasn't some arrogant or ignorant Sith. He had given their order a new sense of life, and Yoda could, at the very least, respect the intelligence Bane had to recognize that the Sith path could never persist the way it had before the Rule of Two. The Sith Lord sensed this acknowledgement. It didn't make him feel any better that Yoda didn't fear him, but he was fascinated by the resolve from the Jedi across from him. For the next 3 weeks, Yoda and Bane would stay on Moraband together. The Grand Master was kept in prison the entire time, but permitted to move about. The Force-created restraints were elastic, so Yoda could walk around some and move his body if he needed to. This wasn't necessarily mercy, but those who came before Bane would have scolded him for it. He still didn't know that the Sith had survived, but Yoda alluded to the mindset of the Jedi Council before the blockade of Naboo. Yoda obviously knew the truth about the Sith now, but he didn't let Bane know that. So what the Sith Lord assumed was that the Sith could still be alive, but the Jedi didn't know they existed, or that the Sith literally faded out of existence and the Rule of Two failed. Neither answer really brought him a sense of happiness, especially because he believed Darth Bane would have taken the Sith to new heights beyond him. Though on Coruscant, as a result of Yoda's continued disappearance, the Jedi Council would make a move. Yoda could have been dead, similar to Master Yaddle's disappearance 13 years beforehand. So, they made a move to switch their own ranks. Obi-Wan became Master of the Order, and Windu overseeing as interim Grand Master until Yoda's return or until they held an official vote for it. In these new minor changes, Mace dispatched Master Plo Koon to search for Yoda. The Grand Master had left a trail out there somewhere. It wasn't like their elder friend to just disappear. Surely he had gone to a location that they could find him at. They must have been looking in all the wrong places for the last 3 weeks. Because Plo had recently found Sidious, the Council was confident that he could solve the mystery of Yoda before the end of the war. With Obi-Wan rising to the rank of Master of the Order, a new seat opened up. Luminara unduly would be offered that seat, and she'd accept it. As Yoda and Bane developed this weird dynamic, R2 was able to escape and send a distress signal in the middle of the night to another Jedi frequency nearby. Essentially, R2, who was buzzing on low power mode, escaped the temple, flew Yoda's ship into orbit, sent the transmission, and returned back to his position so Bane wouldn't suspect a thing. Anakin was worried for his droid, but he trusted that Yoda would bring him back in due time. He also wasn't at all aware of the changes made inside the Council chambers, mostly because the Council was hiding things from the Chancellor, which unfortunately for the Order meant them too. Bane wouldn't suspect anything. He and Yoda would start another round of philosophical discussions. These weren't arguments, they were literal discussions. The thing about Bane that made him such a deadly Sith was his ability to listen. An old Republic warrior like Malgus wouldn't ever give the time to his opponent. In this scenario, Malgus would have likely killed Yoda and wasted away without anything to do. Bane was curious, interested even. He'd had his interactions with Jedi before, but none as intimate as this. Most conversations were very dull or semi-argumentative in the past. Yoda was willing to participate because a part of him hoped he could sway Bane's mind from the dark path. And though there were some conversations that gave the Sith Lord a new perspective, he would never betray the way of the Sith. It's who he was. He couldn't and wouldn't be anything other than that. While they were speaking and discussing something about the Force, a shuttle landed, and it caught the attention of Yoda and Bane. He was excited, gripping his saber and standing up to greet their visitor. Part of Bane hoped that Yoda had lied about the Sith, but when he peeked through the wreckage of the temple, he saw a Keldor Jedi Master. A proper shuttle was utilized to get here, and Bane smiled. He finally had a ride out. He considered just using it to escape, but he was curious if the Keldor would be any more breakable than the other individual. As Plo walked towards the temple, after investigating Yoda's starship, he pulled his weapon from his belt. He had every reason to assume foul play was at hand, with Yoda not present. The Grand Master's vessel couldn't fly without the engine starters, which R2 took out again. Someone had pulled them out, as Plo diagnosed. When the Jedi Master walked between the towering pillars that sat at either side of the entrance, he felt cold, and before he could realize why, he ignited his lightsaber. Darth Bane raged forward, smashing his weapon down as Plo ignited his weapon and their sabers clashed away. Plo was caught completely off guard, defending himself from his opponent, as he too pieced together what Yoda did initially. How could this be? And this confusion was blinding, but he avoided a strike, spinning back behind a pillar and letting Bane lodge his saber into it. As Plo countered, swinging his weapon down at the Sith, Bane thrusted his elbow out, allowing his Orbalisk armor to defend him. Unlike Cortosis, it didn't ignite the saber, but it acted a lot like Beskar. Plo backed away, watching his opponent and then matching the strikes made at him. He weaved his saber upwards and across his body, pulling his feet back to avoid getting cut off at the leg. He did everything he could before attacking forward. Bane watched the Keldor, avoiding a strike and then launching debris at Plo. He cut through it, but it was a great diversion. He rolled his saber above his shoulders as Bane leapt from the air and cut down. Plo fell to his knees, and even with a swing that would have cut Bane in half, the Sith Lord, after dodging the next strike, fired electricity into Plo's face and captured yet another Jedi. While the Keldor Counselor was knocked out, inside the same type of restraints that Yoda had on, Bane investigated the T6 shuttle. The Sith Lord looked through different pieces of information and gathered as much as he could. There were records inside the Jedi archives inside this ship reporting on Sidious' death, Count Dooku, and a mysterious Sith Lord who operated everything behind the scenes. Bane ran through that information at rapid speeds, picking up all the details he could without stopping. That foolish old man thought he could keep everything from him. After doing some more digging, he learned where he needed to go. Before doing that, he went back inside the temple to taunt his foes. He told Yoda and Plo that they'd be staying here until further notice. He wanted them to stay alive long enough to watch their galaxy crumble, and watch his age-old dream become the foundation of a new Sith Order, the rule of two, that is. Bane abandoned the temple and took a T6 to Sereno so that he could confront this Count Dooku individual. Dooku was a weird name for a Sith, but they could change that if need be. To preface, Darth Bane was not here to take command over the CIS, or the Sith, or anything else. He wanted to be sure that the Sith survived. That was his only objective. There were two realities in his mind. If Dooku was a Sith, then his plan had come to fruition. The Sith were still alive, and Bane would assist as need be, but he would not intervene. If the Sith were indeed dead, then he would be the one to bring their order back from the dead. These were the only two alternative realities in Bane's mind. A big reason he didn't want to interject with the modern Sith is because that would make him a hypocrite. Of course he wanted power, but not at the expense of the Sith Order. He would guide, not control. He hoped that Count Dooku was the last of the Sith, or at the very least, a great descendant of his lineage. The modern Sith, including Sidious, were unaware of their ancient founder returning. The Jedi also had no clue. The tracker in Plo's ship was going from Moraband to Sereno. Plo had informed the Jedi that he was investigating a distress call from Moraband, but he did not request reinforcements. So in the eyes of those watching from Coruscant, it looked like Plo picked up a trail and was following it to Sereno. When Bane found himself on the home world of Count Dooku, Tyrannus sensed a disturbance in the Force almost immediately, but didn't know why. Bane didn't try and bypass the Separatist fleet, he just avoided it and landed in the forest. His trek from the landing zone to the castle wasn't very hard, and he arrived just in time for dusk. The sun lit the walkway and he walked it, breezing past battle droids that he crushed with a flex of his hand. As he stepped into the castle, he searched for Tyrannus, but he did not call out Dooku's name. Eventually, he slipped around the corner and looked at a desk at the main hall. The Sith apprentice rose from his desk and looked at the individual, demanding an answer. Bane spoke triumphantly, demanding one resolution. Dooku looked around almost confusedly, but also making sure no one else was here to visit him, assuming it was another assassination. Bane asked if he was a Sith Lord, and Dooku nodded his head slowly. Almost euphorically, Bane raised his hands in excitement, proclaiming that the Force had saved their religion. Dooku squinted his eyes for a moment and thought, asking his intruder a question. Was he Darth Bane? The Sith Lord nodded his head, and as Dooku prepared to pull his saber to defeat the individual, he realized how unnecessary that would be. He asked how his return was possible, and Bane truthfully didn't know, but he did know that he had more questions about the status of the Sith, and Dooku waved Bane to his desk. They had much to discuss. On Moraband, Plo and Yoda sat next to each other, pondering what the Sith Lord was trying to do. They hypothesized that he'd be trying to unite with the other Sith, but Yoda, after spending a few weeks with him, knew it wouldn't be that simple. Bane's intelligence was commendable, and Yoda, for the first time since the return of the Sith, following Qui-Gon's death, confessed that the Jedi had been too overconfident in their approach to the Sith. Bane's lineage had secretly survived for almost a millennium, and no one knew. The Jedi would be wise, especially here without reinforcements, to not underestimate their opponent. Plo asked what they should do then, and Yoda came to a conclusion that they needed to connect themselves to the darkness here, so that they could truly bond with Bane. Plo understood, and offered himself up for this. Yoda refused, but Plo knew that Yoda's skills were needed. Bane was able to defeat Plo, but Yoda was surprised by his attack. He never knew, and surely, Yoda could stop Bane and or Dooku if need be. Plus, as Plo stated, only Yoda could fly his ship and fit inside of it. He had to be the one to leave. So, after finally agreeing that Master Plo would sacrifice himself to the dark side of the Force, they spoke through a ritual. This wasn't a literal self-sacrifice, but it would dump Plo into darkness, allowing it to envelop him and connect with him. It would be everything against his ways as a Force user, and it could very easily corrupt him, forcing him to undergo years of therapeutic work to undo it. In his mind, it was the sacrifice he needed to make. Plo Koon steadied his hands into the ground and released all of his training, his bond to the light, and allowed the poison of the Sith homeworld to seep into his skin and become one with his soul. In this, Plo was able to connect with various Sith Lords, feel their power, anger, see their history and death, and victory. He understood them all and became one with their kind. Just as he could see those from ancient times, he could see Bane in the now. At the castle, Bane and Tyrannus had spoken through the Sith plan. Dooku wasn't fully unwise here, but he trusted Bane. This was the individual who created the Rule of Two, the most selfless Sith in their entire history. Bane also revealed his plans early on, so that he could be everything the modern Sith needed him to be, which is why Tyrannus trusted him. But as they spoke through their plans and the setup, and the individual named Sidious, Bane became slightly concerned. The first worrisome piece of information was Dooku's age. He was significantly older than Palpatine, which was by 20 years. Bane didn't say anything, but he realized that either Dooku was ignorantly following Sidious, assuming he had a peace, or he knew the truth and accepted it. Though what concerned Bane the most was not the victory. Tyrannus had concepts of the plans that'd be going into the Galactic Empire. He didn't know what the truths were, but that's because he would never see it. Though what became abundantly clear to Bane was the existential threat to the Sith that Palpatine was. It was very morally confounding for him, because the Rule of Two was created so that the Sith would win, but he also could tell that Sidious would destroy the Sith if he won. Bane silently tuned out Dooku and thought on what this meant for the future. The Sith Order was what he was loyal to. In a scenario where Tyrannus was the Sith Lord, then the Order would survive. Dooku would take on Skywalker as his apprentice, and Anakin would destroy him to become the Emperor of the CIS and the galaxy. A simple reframing of things could perhaps save all of the Sith. Bane didn't know Palpatine and only went off of what Tyrannus said about him. The irony is, Dooku was clearly beyond loyal to his master. He had no intentions of betraying him. There were, of course, contingencies in the scenario that Palpatine attempted to pull the rug out from under him, but Bane couldn't help but be concerned about this Sidious individual. He specifically noted how intense the transition between Maul and Tyrannus was. Not even a full day after the presumed death of Maul did Tyrannus become a new apprentice. The need for survival was necessary, of course, and Bane understood that, but it all seemed like a revolving door, all in service of Sidious. Bane stopped answering and got up, so that he could think for a moment. Tyrannus asked what the problem was. Did he not have it in him anymore? Did he understand what he and his master had created? And Bane snapped back, asking how Dooku didn't see it. He was never going to be a part of that empire. He was never meant to live in it, and honestly speaking, Skywalker would be nothing but a replaceable asset. Sidious had greater aspirations, and the Sith, the main focus of the Rule of Two, was not what he focused on. While Bane shouldn't care and honestly was making a bit of a big deal out of it, he was married to the Sith Order. It was his religion, his cult, and he saved it by himself. He was the architect of the survival of the Sith Order, and now it would be used for one man's control, taking advantage of religious tradition to manipulate others lesser than him. And it was so arrogant too. Bane was furious. His life's work was being turned around. The Sith were not in control here, and Bane refused to even call Palpatine one of them. He was using the Sith as a stepping stone. If anything, he was a dark side adept, who used the legacy of the Rule of Two to lure unsuspecting fools into his trap. Tyrannus would defend his master, but all it did was begin an entirely new phase of conversations that revolved around the Sith, Sidious, and Tyrannus' place. Bane was honest about his intentions though. He wasn't here for himself, and if he was, he would have killed Tyrannus the second he walked in. Bane cared for the Sith Order, and promised Dooku, eventually, after hours of discussions and debates, that he would help Tyrannus become the Sith Lord, and if he promised to fulfill the true purpose of the Rule of Two, then Bane wouldn't get involved or hinder his growth. Plo on Moraband reiterated these revelations to the Grand Master. Yoda was puzzled about this plan, but if the Separatists could take control over the galaxy with their droid armies, then they'd be unstoppable. Plo was shaking as he tried to retain autonomy over his own body, but the dark side was still coursing through him. In a last-ditch effort to free himself, he shoved his hand against the pillar, knocking Yoda's restraints free and allowing the Grand Master to release himself. Yoda popped up and moved to Plo's side to heal him and help him through this. Plo, with the last little bit of energy he had, told his friend to stop the Sith. He wasn't a concern. He had done what he needed to do, but Yoda wouldn't abandon him. Plo was savable. The Sith were about to do what they always did, live in spite of themselves. Inside the Senate Parliament on Raxus, Palpatine landed under the cover of night. Tyrannus requested for his instructor to visit him. He had found a Republic strategy that he was too worried to send across the stars. He basically framed it as a plot that would destroy the Sith plan and uproot the CIS reserve fleet by accident. It was also explained that the Republic was keeping it from him because they wanted the strategy to be efficient without bureaucracy. Obviously, this was all a lie, but according to Dooku, it was so well hidden that the Jedi weren't even involved. Palpatine believed that Dooku was being truthful. He hadn't shown any inclinations towards betraying him, and every time Palpatine demanded loyalty, he got it. As Palpatine walked with an armed guard to Dooku's executive office, the doors were closed behind him and the blinds lowered. Tyrannus turned the hologram on and showed it to Palpatine as he got closer. When he was in front of the desk, a lightsaber ignited. Sidious naturally assumed Ventress had been recruited again, and didn't bother to turn back to face her, as he told his former student that this war would be won without him, and the galaxy would be reshaped to desolation that the Republic couldn't even fathom. All of Dooku's dreams were for nothing. In this taunting, everything Bane theorized came to reality. Dooku's weapon rang into action, and lightsabers swung in. Palpatine and Dooku traded blows instantly, and as Sidious used the desk as leverage to punish Ventress, he turned back to see a much different opponent. It shocked him enough that his momentum fell, and he ducked, swinging under Bane and hitting the Arbalest armor, before colliding with Dooku defensively. Palpatine ignited his second saber and spread out. Tyrannus was no longer the duelist he once was, but this was Darth Bane, a true warrior and a master of saber combat. To Sidious, though, that was a weakness. He lunged in. Their weapons all sizzled when they collided, before he pulled away and deflected strikes at his adversaries. Bane shoved forward and pushed Palpatine backwards. The Sith Lord of the modern era spun aggressively, using his finesse to impress even the likes of Bane. Their weapons screamed with each connection, and Sidious slowly got frustrated, before pulling his saber around and firing electricity at Bane, who defended himself but slid across the floors. Outside of the orbit of Moraband, Yoda opened his long-range scanners and got into contact with another Jedi who had their communicator open. Windu asked who it was, and he was relieved to hear of Yoda's survival. Everything was relayed. Firstly, Master Kenobi followed the previous T6 shuttle to Sereno and put a tracker on Dooku's solar sailor before they left. Yoda told Windu to dispatch Obi-Wan to Moraband to save Plo Koon. He was in serious trouble, but Yoda had preserved his life. Mace would do that, before telling Yoda that he was heading towards Raxus. The Jedi Master was going to follow, informing Yoda on the way to the Separatist capital of everything Plo had seen inside of the vision on the Sith home world. The clashing of Crimson Sabers continued. Sidious figured everything out, but didn't know how Bane was back. He just planned on stopping this alliance. He danced between opponents. Dooku, in his old age, remained a strong figure, even at his best, but Sidious was more daring than his older apprentice. He thrusted his saber into Dooku's defense, but Bane saved him. Their weapons bounced and weaved, as Bane kicked at Palpatine, who used the Force to twist him back, knocking Bane off his feet. The Sith Lord jabbed in, but Dooku slapped down, knocking a blade from Palpatine, and the modern Sith Lord turned, backhanding his still weaponized arm and cutting Dooku across the abdomen. Bane looked up and watched Tyrannus fall to his knees. As Sidious prepared to execute him, Bane threw his hands forward and pushed Palpatine back. Lord Bane didn't typically like to use the Force during duels. His opponent was quite the opposite. The ancient Sith Lord preferred a straight fight, and he launched himself at Palpatine. They collided and continued to swing at each other, each never finding the advantage, and every time Palpatine did land a hit, the armor remained impenetrable to him. This frustrated Palpatine, but he used the Force, firing electricity at his opponent. Bane blocked it with all of his strength, and the wounded Dooku rose up behind Palpatine, and just as he shoved forward, Sidious weaved out of the way and shoved his own saber through Tyrannus' body. He smiled, but just as he felt completion and victory, it was all taken away, when Bane punctured Palpatine's back and dropped the modern Sith Lord. Just as it was before, it would be again. Bane would be a final survivor in a fight that engulfed the Sith in total defeat. His religion, their cult, it could never be saved because people like Palpatine would use tradition for personal gain. It could never survive because the inherent selfishness that created their order would destroy it from the inside out eventually. However, now, as the final Sith alive again, aside from the mentally incapable Maul on Mandalore, Bane needed action. He turned towards the exit, and just as he opened it, Yoda and Mace stood before him. The two Jedi were on the move before Palpatine ever landed on Raxus. They were just a few moments short, but that was fine. Bane, already tired of his fight, pulled Dooku's curved hilt into his hands and ignited 2 sabers. Windu and Yoda readied themselves and moved in. Yoda admittedly was pretty weak, but he would be here to stop the Sith, because that's why Plo made the sacrifice of giving his mind over to their religion. Their weapons connected, and Windu shoved forward, pressing aggressively. Both he and Bane practiced Form 7 exceptionally well, but Bane had been long dead when Vapad was created. Yoda and Mace practiced many times together. They were very familiar and comfortable acting with one another. While all of their practice sessions were 1 versus 1s, they knew how the other fought, which is all that really mattered. In the engagement between Dooku, Bane, and Sidious, everyone was basically fresh working against each other. This time it was completely different. These Jedi knew how to work together. Despite his previous fight, Bane rose to the challenge, slashing aggressively and not allowing the Jedi to get too offensive with him. He recognized that he would fail by giving into defense. Yoda moved through the air, jumping and leaping and slashing. Windu shoved in, jabbing and slicing more aggressively, pulling off of Bane's inherent use of the darkness. Even with their combined aggressive assault, Darth Bane was defended by his armor. It kept their sabers away from his skin and protected his body from imminent death, but there were still weaknesses on his suit of armor. Yoda and Windu, as they continued to press him, realized the key. They, after landing several key hits with their sabers and not doing damage, would pull back and raise their hands. In using the Force, they would crush Bane's body under the weight of his own armor. The armor itself slowly bended in, and he attacked to stop them. Mace got in front of Yoda and blocked the strikes, pushing Bane back and keeping both swinging blades from hitting him. Yoda continued to focus all of his energy, but the pain fed the Sith Lord. Bending the armor was nearly impossible, but nothing was impossible in Yoda's eyes. He continued focusing, and Bane cried out in anger and agony as Mace bashed against the armor and defended the sabers, until all at once, the Sith Lord dropped to the ground. The metal had pierced his heart and killed him on impact. Yoda and Mace kept their distance and looked down at the 3 bodies, noticing who Palpatine was, and deciding to stay away from this scene. They uncovered Palpatine's face and positioned everything to look as if Darth Bane had been a rogue assailant, an individual who worked for both of them, and betrayed them after learning the truth. The 2 Jedi would escape after making the scene look like a murder-suicide, and they would take their vessels to abandon Raxus before the Separatist Senate would gather in the coming minutes. The following would be a total scandal, though it wouldn't directly end the Clone War. The Separatist business sponsors would remain quiet about their involvement with the shadowy man, who happened to also be Palpatine. They would attempt to use this as blackmail to gain more control, but it would result in them becoming the target. If the Republican Confederacy couldn't find peace through combat, then they could at the very least make a new enemy for themselves to hate. The following would be a long, drawn-out 2-year war. In it, the Separatist Council would become a rogue nation, arming themselves with General Grievous and the Separatist Reserve Forces. The CIS would maintain control over their already activated droid armies, and it would become a combined war of battle droids and clones versus more battle droids. It wasn't exactly preferable, and the citizen casualty counts would be higher in these 2 years than in the 3 years that preceded it. In the end, though, there would be peace. The Jedi would be the bringers of said peace, but there would be no reunification. The Confederacy had earned their right to autonomy without the Republic. They would stay far away from the Coruscant-based Republic and start their own new government. The war would hurt both sides very badly, but at the very least, they would agree to no new conflict. There would be an elongated Cold War, as the Senate purchased more clones from Kamino, before learning that they too were involved in the Sith plot. Darth Bane's death would mark the end of the Sith. Splinter groups like Maul's Crimson Dawn, the Knights of Ren, and the Acolytes of Beyond wouldn't ever find prominence. But with the Jedi Order still strong and never facing the wrath of Order 66, they would be able to put an end to each of their respective groups, either completely destroying them or bringing them to justice. Master Plo Koon would, by the end of the second half of the war, recover from his trip on Moraband. The Jedi Council would then decide to remove all signs of the Sith. It was time for their religion to forever disappear. Even though Yoda was the old Grand Master, he would not take Mace's seat back. He would remain an advisor and a teacher, both of which he loved doing until the day he died. He also loved to reminisce about his conversations with Bane, always wondering, what if Bane had joined him? Obi-Wan would keep his seat as Master of the Order as well, and eventually those from his own lineage would join him on the High Council. Though by that point, the wars were over. the peace was brought to the galaxy, and balance was finally restored, the Force. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Let's talk about this mystical story. This one, more or less, is a bit more fantastical with the elements of the Force used. You can't really, like in the title it says, like, accidentally. Like, it is literally an accident. And this one does play with a lot of, like, really odd kind of Force powers, which is kind of intentional. I kind of think that Darth Bane wouldn't really like Palpatine that much. I think he'd very easily pick up on it too, because he saw how the Sith were destroyed. He understood what caused their downfall to begin with, and I think he would be like, yo, this guy's a psycho. We gotta deal with that. And it's kind of a 50-50 draw with Dooku. I think Dooku more or less would see an opportunity in this because Darth Bane is a renowned duelist. I think more or less for Dooku, he sees true victory in using the Confederacy to become the new Emperor, essentially, which is why he's doing it. Because Bane, as I said, I don't think he'd be involved. I think Bane has a sort of humility to him, that he would be able to be like, you know, I'm not the current era. I didn't really want to be back because the Sith were meant to continue on without me. So it's kind of fun, and I really enjoyed kind of putting Yoda and Bane into that position because they're kind of both from around the same time, and I really like just putting them there for 3 weeks, kind of just to talk about philosophy with each other. Just an interesting way to maintain that kind of balance. As for the final fight, if Dooku wasn't there, I believe that Palpatine would have won. If Dooku wasn't there, I think Palpatine's skilled enough with both the Force and the lightsaber to beat Bane. It's just that armor is really what does it. Without the armor, I don't think Bane really holds a candle to these guys. I think Mace and Windu would have crushed him, and I think Palpatine would have beat Dooku and Bane without the armor. But with the armor on, which is what he was attached to for the use of the story, his soul was attached to that. Kind of like the Mask of Momin. He's just attached to that, and without that armor, he doesn't really have something to be attached to come back with, aside from like a lightsaber. So just kind of an explanation for why the duel in the end kind of persisted so long. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.